welcome to my first digital photography tutorial on how to shoot manual mode on a DSLR. The camera we'll be using today is a Nikon D800. All DSLRs are going to have essentially the same settings to get you to what I'll be doing with this camera, but they might be located a little differently on the camera body. To start off, we're going to talk a little bit about the light metering selections on the camera. The Nikon D800 has 3 metering selections: spot, center weighted, and matrix. Depends on kind of like your shooting style as to what meter selection you really want to use. Personally, for me, I like to use spot just because I like to look around the frame and kind of use the zone system of exposure to choose the brightness levels I want of each object. And spot allows you to select individual portions of the frame and do that. The center weighted function balances your exposure for what's centered in the frame of your camera. Essentially, as you're moving your camera around and looking for exposure, those levels will change depending on how bright objects are in your frame. The matrix setting for the metering is, it takes essentially all of the information coming into the frame, and the camera comes up with the best exposure setting using a formula. This is the most common exposure function that people use, but I find it that I like to be a little bit more in control with the spot setting. Let's talk about how to adjust where your exposure levels are. There's essentially 3 different tools to control exposure on a DSLR camera: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Let's talk a little bit about ISO. ISO is the sensitivity of your camera sensor. It starts with the lowest sensitivity settings, usually about 100, and works its way progressively up to more sensitive. And the more sensitive your sensor is to light, the more grain and noise that it will pick up in the image. So a good rule of thumb for ISO is to always shoot the lowest possible with the lens you're using and the shutter speed and the light you have available. So if I'm outside in the sunlight like I am today, I'll usually try and shoot a really low ISO, usually around 100. You can manually set ISO by holding down the ISO button on the top of the camera and using this back selector dial to scroll through the ISO settings. So I'm going to set mine at 100. The next choice we have to make as photographers is, what are we trying to accomplish with the image? Say if we're shooting a sporting event, do we want to be able to freeze motion? Or are we outside and shooting cars and traffic and we want to blur the cars going by so all we can see is streaks of headlights? That's controlled by the shutter speed. The shutter speed controls how long the shutter is open and how long that sensor is exposed. The longer a shutter speed is, the more blur and motion you're going to get, but also the more light you're going to get to the sensor. The shorter or faster shutter speed it is will freeze motion, but you don't allow a lot of light to hit the sensor. Select the shutter speed, scroll through on the camera on this back dial to choose one that meets our creative needs. The next thing that you have to think about is the aperture of your camera. Aperture has the most control over the depth of field of your image. For instance, to get a shallow depth of field or very selective focus, you want to use a very wide aperture. The lens that I'm shooting with today is a 50mm 1.4. That means at its widest aperture setting, it's at a 1.4. And then I have selection of 2, 2.8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16. Now at a 1.4, it's an extremely shallow depth of field, and it's hard to really get enough in focus to show what a photograph is. This works well for sort of a macro effect, or really selecting in on a very small detail. With this lens, you can shoot as close down as a 16 to get a deep depth of field. So to scroll through this, change your aperture settings. You can use this front dial on the camera to scroll through the options.
So now that we understand our tools for setting exposure in manual mode on a DSLR, now we're going to put that into action. I'm going to be photographing this wagon wheel today that's in the shade, so there's a fairly even exposure, but I can see a little bit of sunlight hitting right here, as well as some sunlight in the background that's going to affect our exposure, our choice selection. So I'm going to keep my metering in spot mode, and I'm going to look around the frame with that spot mode and pick out selections, make sure that I've got within a shallow range of stops exposed so that nothing's blowing out and nothing's too dark. I'm also going to be prioritizing the aperture here because I really want to control the depth of field of this image. One thing I'm really going to pay attention to about shutter speed is that I don't want to go under a 30th of a second because when shooting handheld, it's very hard to eliminate camera shake at that slow of a shutter speed. So I'm going to keep my shutter speed at 30 or above, but within that range, I'm going to keep my aperture at a 2.8 and adjust my shutter speed for the proper exposure of this photograph. I'm going to shoot at 1/60th of a second, still at an f2.8 and ISO 100. So now you know the steps of taking a properly exposed photograph using the manual settings on your DSLR. You start with choosing your proper meter mode, using your ISO, shutter speed, and aperture to adjust that meter to get a properly exposed photograph. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.